In the summer of 612 before Christ, a city of 100,000 souls, ringed by 12 kilometers of double walls and 15 fortified gates, was erased from the face of the earth in roughly 90 days. Within a single generation, Nineveh stood empty. Within 2 centuries, a Greek army marched directly past its mounds and did not know its name. For more than 2,000 years, the largest city the world had ever seen lay buried beneath its own dust, remembered only in scripture and whispered fragments of legend. And here is the fact that sounds impossible but is carved in stone. When archaeologists finally cut into those mounds in the 1840s, they found palace corridors lined with over 3 kilometers of carved reliefs still standing in the dark, and a library of more than 30,000 clay tablets still stacked in their rooms, waiting. How does the greatest city on earth vanish so completely that no one can even point to where it stood, and yet preserve its own voice in baked clay for those who finally come looking? This is the complete biography of Nineveh. Not a summary, not a single famous ruin, the entire life of a city, from its first breath to its last, and everything that came after the silence. We begin 6,000 years before the Common Era, where the Tigris bends east and a smaller river called the Kosur flows down from the hills to meet it. We will watch the first settlements rise on the mound of Kuyunjik, layer upon layer, century after century, long before anyone had invented writing. We will stand inside the Temple of Ishtar, one of the oldest continuously sacred places in all of Mesopotamia, already ancient when the Assyrian Empire was young. We will follow the road that leads from provincial shrine to world capital, and we will witness the moment Sennacherib chose this place and imposed upon it a vision of urban engineering without equal. Walls, gates, canals, and a limestone aqueduct stretching 50 kilometers from the mountains, carrying water across a valley on corbelled arches to feed a city that could not survive without it. We will walk the streets at their fullest. Breweries measuring out daily beer rations for laborers, textile workshops staffed by deportees speaking a dozen languages, markets where barley, sesame oil, and lapis lazuli changed hands beneath the shadow of colossal winged bulls. We will enter the library where Ashurbanipal, a king who boasted in his own handwriting that he could read the cunning tablets of Sumer, gathered the knowledge of the ancient world onto shelves of clay. And we will watch the shadows gather. A civil war between brothers that cracked the empire from within. Succession crises that no chronicle fully explains. Armies that once conquered everything now stretched too thin to hold anything. The coalition forming on the horizon. The floodwaters rising against mud brick. Then the silence. Centuries of it. Shepherds grazing flocks on a mound that held palaces. A mosque built over a buried arsenal. And finally, the moment the earth gave back what it had swallowed, and the modern world came face to face with a civilization it had nearly forgotten. What makes Nineveh irreplaceable is not merely its scale, though its scale still astonishes. It is that this city's library preserved the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest great story in human literature. It is that its aqueduct anticipated Roman engineering by centuries. It is that the very tablets pulled from its ruins forced the 19th century to redraw the map of human history. The truth excavated from Nineveh is stranger, grander, and more unsettling than any legend ever told about it. If you value complete journeys through the great cities of history, subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Each time we bring one legendary city fully back to life, from its first hearthfire to its final silence, and everything the evidence reveals between. Let us begin where every city begins, with the land itself, long before the first wall, at a bend in the river where two waters meet, and someone decided this ground was worth holding. The Tigris runs southeast out of the mountains of eastern Anatolia, cutting through limestone gorges before it reaches the upper plains of Mesopotamia. Here the land opens, the river slows, and at one particular bend, where the current swings eastward against a low ridge of natural rock, a smaller stream enters from the northeast, the Kosa, draining the foothills of the Zagros. The two waters meet at the edge of a broad, flat alluvial plain, dark with silt deposited across millennia of seasonal flooding. The ford is shallow enough to cross on foot in the dry months. The soil is deep enough to grow barley without irrigation. The hills behind offer limestone for building and flint for tools. And the ridge itself, a natural elevation rising above the floodplain, provides dry ground that no spring torrent can reach. This is the place, not chosen by any king or planner, but selected by the logic of water, soil, and elevation over thousands of years of human need. The mound that will one day be called Kuyunjik begins here, not as a city, but as a few clusters of reed and mud dwellings pressed against the ridge above the confluence, sometime around 6,000 years before the Common Era. What Max Mallowan's excavations revealed in the 1930s, cutting deep shafts into the base of Kuyunjik, was a sequence of occupation stretching back into the late Neolithic, layers of ash, compacted earth, and broken pottery descending more than 20 meters below the surface. The earliest sherds belong to the Hassuna tradition, simple buff-colored ware shaped by hand. Above them, painted ceramics of the Halaf period appear. Fine, thin-walled vessels decorated with geometric patterns in red and brown, evidence of a community connected to a cultural network stretching across northern Mesopotamia from the Mediterranean to the Zagros foothills. The potters here were not isolated villagers. They shared designs, techniques, and likely trade goods with settlements hundreds of kilometers distant. Then the Ubaid layers arrive, a southern Mesopotamian tradition spreading northward, its characteristic greenish pottery replacing local styles. The settlement grows. Mud brick architecture becomes more substantial. The mound rises, each generation building on the compressed debris of the last, the ridge growing taller with every century. By the late 5th millennium, the site covers several hectares. By the 4th millennium, as the Uruk period transforms southern Mesopotamia with the first cities and the earliest writing, the mound at the Tigris bend is already ancient, 3,000 years of continuous habitation compressed into the earth beneath it. The pottery sequence known as Ninevite 5, dating to roughly 3,000 years before the Common Era, gives the site its first name in the archaeological record. These distinctive vessels, incised and excised wares with sharp geometric decoration, mark a regional culture centered on the upper Tigris. The settlement is substantial now, a town of perhaps a few thousand people, though no written records survive from this level. What the earth preserves instead is structure. Post holes, hearth ash, animal bones showing domesticated sheep and cattle, carbonized grain, and the steady vertical accumulation that tells the simplest and most important story. People came here and they stayed. They stayed because the geography was not merely adequate, but exceptional. The Tigris provided water, fish, and a transportation corridor linking the mountains to the southern plains. The Kosar offered a secondary water source and a route into the eastern hills. The ford meant that every traveler, every herd, every trader moving between the highlands and the river valley passed through this point. The alluvial plain produced surplus grain. The limestone ridge provided defense against flood. No single advantage would have been enough. Together they created a site that human settlement could not abandon. By 3,000 years before the Common Era, the mound stands high enough to be visible from the river for a considerable distance, a landmark on the Tigris, already layered with the compressed memory of 3 millennia. No one living on it knows how deep the foundations go. No one can guess what will be built on top of them, but the place has already proven the one thing that matters: it endures. And somewhere on the mound's upper surface, in a location that later centuries will rebuild again and again, the earliest traces of a shrine begin to appear, a sacred space oriented toward something older than any empire, dedicated to a presence the city will carry in its name for as long as it exists. That shrine on the summit of Kuyunjik is, by the early 3rd millennium before the Common Era, no longer a tentative cluster of offerings around a bare altar. It has become a building, mud brick walls enclosing a cellar, a sacred inner room where a cult image stands in permanent residence. The goddess who inhabits it is Ishtar, known in Sumerian as Inanna, the most complex and volatile deity in the Mesopotamian pantheon. Goddess of desire and war, of the morning and evening star, of fertility and devastation in equal measure. Her presence at this site is already ancient, and it is her presence, not the size of the settlement, not its walls or its trade, that places Nineveh on the mental map of every literate court in Mesopotamia. The city itself remains modest. In the centuries after 3000 before the Common Era, Nineveh is not a capital, not a commercial hub to rival Ur or Uruk, not a seat of kingship. Its population likely numbers in the low thousands. The settlement clusters around the mound, spreading unevenly toward the Khaza's banks, its mud brick houses rebuilt generation after generation on the same compacted footprints. What distinguishes it is singular: the temple. Ishtar of Nineveh carries a reputation that travels far beyond the Tigris plain. Texts from southern Mesopotamian cities reference her cult with a respect that implies pilgrimage, diplomatic gifts, and theological weight. The shrine draws visitors the settlement alone never could. The proof arrives carved in stone. Manishtushu, king of Akkad and son of Sargon the Great, records building work at the Ishtar temple at Nineveh, sometime around 2200 before the Common Era. His inscription, recovered from the site, confirms that the rulers of the world's first known empire, seated at Akkad, hundreds of kilometers to the south, considered this provincial temple worthy of royal patronage and monumental investment. The gesture is political as much as pious. By rebuilding Ishtar's house, an Akkadian king binds a northern city to his dynasty's legitimacy. But it also reveals something about the temple's stature. Kings do not rebuild obscure shrines, they rebuild famous ones. The Akkadian Empire collapses, the Gutian period passes, the third dynasty of Ur rises in the south and extends administrative control across much of Mesopotamia. Nineveh appears in Ur's records, referenced in economic and administrative texts that confirm the city exists within the broader network of trade, taxation, and temple management that Ur's bureaucracy maintains. The Ishtar temple continues to function through every political transition, its priesthood outlasting dynasties, its rituals performed without interruption across centuries of upheaval. Votive objects accumulate in its foundation deposits: small figurines, cylinder seals, clay models, each one a material prayer left by someone who traveled to this mound because the goddess who lived here was known to listen. By the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 before the Common Era, Nineveh appears in the correspondence networks of the age. Hammurabi of Babylon, whose law code is carved in distant Susa, knows the city by name. The Ishtar temple has been rebuilt multiple times, each reconstruction raising the floor level, thickening the walls, enlarging the precinct. Excavators cutting through these layers in the 20th century found the stratigraphic evidence unmistakable. Phase built upon phase, each one respecting the orientation and sacred geography of the last, as though the architects of every generation understood that the holiness of the site resided not in any single building, but in the ground itself. This is the engine that sustains Nineveh through its first 3,000 years. Not conquest, not commerce, but sanctity. The temple generates economic activity. Offerings require livestock, grain, oil, and craft goods. Pilgrims need lodging and food. Priests employ scribes, builders, and servants. A sacred economy grows around the cellar like a living organism around a heartbeat. The city does not yet need walls worthy of a king. It does not yet need an empire. It needs only the goddess and the unbroken belief that she dwells here and nowhere else with quite the same intensity. But to the south and east, forces are stirring that will reshape the entire Tigris corridor. A city called Ashur, seated on a limestone bluff downstream, is beginning to project military and commercial power outward along the river roads. Its merchants already trade as far as Anatolia. Its kings are beginning to use a word that will define the next millennium of Mesopotamian history: Assyria. And Nineveh, Ishtar's quiet city on the Kosa, sits directly in their path. Ashur is not, at first, a conqueror. It is a merchant city, perched on its limestone bluff where the Tigris narrows, sending its traders north and west along donkey caravan routes that reach deep into Anatolia. By the 20th century before the Common Era, Assyrian merchant colonies operate at Kanesh in central Turkey, trading tin and textiles for silver and gold. Their records, preserved on thousands of clay tablets found in the houses of Kanesh, reveal a society of meticulous bookkeepers, pragmatic negotiators, and ambitious families, but not yet empire builders. Ashur's power is commercial, its reach measured in credit networks rather than garrison towns. Then comes Shamshi-Adad I. Around 1808 before the Common Era, this Amorite warrior seizes the throne of Ashur and, for the first time, welds the cities of the Upper Tigris and the Kabul Triangle into something resembling a territorial state. His kingdom stretches from the Zagros foothills to the Euphrates, and Nineveh, sitting on its ancient mound at the Kosa's mouth, falls squarely within his domain. Shamshi-Adad recognizes what the site already is, a cult center of deep prestige, and invests in the Ishtar temple at Kuyunjik. Construction records indicate rebuilding and enlargement. The goddess's shrine receives royal patronage not because Nineveh is politically important, but because its sanctity lends legitimacy to a king who needs it. The temple grows. The settlement around it thickens. But the capital remains Ashur, and when Shamshi-Adad dies around 1776 before the Common Era, his improvised kingdom fractures within a generation. For the next 4 centuries, Nineveh passes through the hands of competing powers. The Mitanni kingdom, a Hurrian-speaking state ruling from the Kabul region, dominates northern Mesopotamia for much of the 15th and 14th centuries before the Common Era. Nineveh lies within Mitanni's sphere. The Ishtar temple continues to function. Its holiness transcends political boundaries, but the city itself remains modest, a provincial center in someone else's empire. The turning point arrives with the Middle Assyrian resurgence. Around 1363 before the Common Era, Ashurbanipal I begins reasserting Assyrian independence from Mitanni's crumbling authority. His successors push outward with increasing confidence. By the reign of Shalmaneser I, around 1274 to 1245 before the Common Era, Assyria controls the entire upper Tigris corridor and the network of cities along it. Ashur, Nineveh, and the site that will later become Nimrud, functions as an integrated heartland. Administrative tablets from this period show Nineveh appearing in royal itineraries, receiving governors, contributing resources to the crown. It is Tiglath-Pileser I, reigning around 1114 to 1076 before the Common Era, who leaves the clearest early mark. His inscriptions record restoration work on the Ishtar temple at Nineveh, describing how the old structure had fallen into disrepair and how he rebuilt it from its foundations. The language is formulaic but revealing. The king presents himself as the goddess's servant, restoring what time has damaged, earning divine favor through brick and bitumen. The temple's footprint expands. Its mud brick platform rises higher on the mound of Kuyunjik, each rebuilding adding another layer to the stratigraphy that archaeologists will one day read like a vertical chronicle. Yet even now, Nineveh does not rule. Ashur remains the ceremonial and administrative heart. Nineveh is the second city, the sacred city, the city whose importance is spiritual and geographic rather than political. Its position on the Tigris ford, its command of routes running east into the Zagros and north toward the copper sources of Anatolia, its deep wells and the Khosr's reliable flow, all of these make it indispensable to any power controlling Upper Mesopotamia. But indispensable is not the same as supreme. The Ishtar temple stands rebuilt in grander limestone and mud brick, its cellar receiving offerings from a dynasty that grows more militaristic with each generation. Along the Tigris corridor, garrison posts multiply. Bronze weaponry stockpiles grow. The Assyrian army, still modest by later standards, is learning the arts of siege and deportation that will one day reshape the entire Near East. And Nineveh, patient on its mound, absorbs each investment, each rebuilding, each new layer of administrative complexity, waiting for the king who will finally look at this ancient ford and see not a provincial shrine, but the center of the world. That king does not come yet. Instead, the center of gravity shifts south, and Nineveh watches from its mound as other cities claim the throne. Ashurnasirpal II ascends in 883 before the Common Era and makes a decision that will define Assyrian power for a century and a half. He does not choose Nineveh. He chooses Nimrud, ancient Kalhu, 30 kilometers downstream on the Tigris, rebuilding it from a half-abandoned tell into a gleaming imperial capital. His northwest palace rises on a platform of packed earth overlooking the river, its doorways flanked by colossal winged bulls carved from single blocks of gypsum, its walls lined with stone reliefs showing campaigns, hunts, and sacred trees in obsessive, magnificent detail. The inauguration banquet, recorded on a stele found in the palace itself, claims 69,574 guests fed over 10 days, roasted oxen, gazelles, ducks, fish, 10,000 skins of wine, 10,000 jars of beer. The numbers may be inflated, but the ambition is real. Nimrud becomes the beating heart of Assyrian power, and Nineveh remains what it has been for centuries, a revered cult center, a provincial city on the Sosa, its Ishtar temple receiving royal patronage, but not royal residence. The tribute roads run past Nineveh's gates without stopping. Caravans carrying cedar logs from Lebanon, copper ingots from Cyprus, horses from the Iranian plateau, ivory from Egypt and Nubia, all of it flows toward Nimrud's storerooms. The Assyrian military machine, reorganized under Tiglath-Pileser III beginning in 745, before the Common Era, becomes the most efficient instrument of conquest the ancient world has seen. He replaces seasonal levies with a standing professional army. He systematizes deportation on a massive scale, entire populations uprooted from conquered territories and resettled across the empire, breaking local resistance while providing labor and skills wherever the state needs them. Tens of thousands of Arameans, Babylonians, and Western peoples are marched along the Tigris corridor. Some pass within sight of Nineveh's walls. The wealth is staggering. Annual tribute lists preserved on palace reliefs and clay tablets record gold, silver, tin, linen, dyed wool, elephants, apes, and exotic woods arriving from provinces stretching from the Mediterranean coast to the Zagros Mountains. Shalmaneser V campaigns against Samaria. The empire's borders press toward Egypt. And still the capital is not Nineveh. Then Sargon II, seizing power in 722 before the Common Era, makes an even more astonishing choice. He bypasses both Nimrud and Nineveh entirely, founding a brand new city from bare ground, Dur-Sharukin, the fortress of Sargon, 15 kilometers northeast of Nineveh. Construction begins around 717 and consumes the empire's resources for over a decade. A city of 300 hectares rises on virgin soil, a walled enclosure, a ziggurat, a palace complex covering 10 hectares, courtyards paved with carved thresholds. Deportee labor gangs from every corner of the empire haul mud brick and cut stone. The city is Sargon's personal monument, designed to eclipse every capital that came before. Nineveh, ancient and patient, sits between these two rivals, Nimrud to the south, Dur-Sharukin to the northeast, watching tribute caravans pass along roads it did not build toward palaces it does not house. Its Ishtar temple still draws pilgrims. Its population, perhaps 20 to 30,000, tends orchards along the Kosa and trades in the markets near the river gate. Administrative tablets from this period show a functioning but modest city, its scribes recording local transactions in barley and wool, while the imperial archives accumulate elsewhere. Then, in 705 before the Common Era, Sargon II falls on a distant battlefield. His body is not recovered, a catastrophe in Assyrian religious terms, suggesting divine disfavor. His son inherits an empire at its zenith and a brand new capital tainted by his father's fate. Dur-Sharukin, barely occupied, falls silent almost overnight. Its corridors empty, its gates close, and the new king turns his gaze toward the ancient mound where the Kosa meets the Tigris, where Ishtar has been worshipped since before anyone could write her name, and begins to imagine something no Assyrian ruler has attempted before. A city built not on virgin ground, but on sacred ground, engineered to a scale that will make Nimrud and Ur-Sharrukin look like provincial towns. His name is Sennacherib, and the scaffolding is already rising on the walls of Kuyunjik. Sennacherib moves fast. Within months of taking the throne in 705 before the Common Era, he issues decrees that will reshape the physical earth itself. His father's ghost city at Dur-Sharrukin is abandoned to the wind. The court, the treasury, the archives, the garrison, everything transfers north to Nineveh, to the ancient mound where Ishtar's temple has stood for 3,000 years. But Sennacherib does not simply move into the old city. He intends to demolish what is insufficient and build what has never existed. His own inscriptions, recovered from foundation deposits beneath the palace walls, describe the ambition in language that leaves nothing to modesty. He calls the project a refounding. The old walls, he declares, had grown cramped and crooked. The old palace of former kings was too small. The Kosa River, running unchecked through the settlement, flooded streets and undermined foundations during the spring rains. Everything must be corrected, expanded, perfected. The new wall circuit stretches approximately 12 kilometers around the city, an enclosure of roughly 750 hectares, making Nineveh the largest walled city on earth. The outer wall, called the Great Wall, rises to a height that Sennacherib's texts boast no enemy could scale. An inner wall backs it. Between them runs a military road wide enough for chariots. 15 gates pierce this circuit, each named for an Assyrian deity or a cardinal function. The Nergal Gate on the north, the Mashki Gate, the Gate of the Watering Place, near the river, the Halzi Gate on the south, where the trade roads enter, the Adad Gate on the east. Each gateway is flanked by colossal stone figures, winged bulls with human heads, carved from single blocks of gypsum alabaster quarried at Balatai, roughly 50 kilometers upstream. Teams of hundreds drag these sculptures on sledges along prepared roads, a process Sennacherib himself commemorates in relief carvings that survive today. Inside the walls, the Kosa River is rechanneled. Sennacherib's engineers cut a new course for the stream, lining sections with dressed stone, building key walls to prevent flooding, constructing weirs to regulate flow. The river becomes infrastructure, controlled, directed, useful. Limestone blocks are laid along its banks where it passes through the city centre. Sluice gates divert water into reservoirs and garden channels. On the summit of Kuyunjik, the great mound, the palace begins to rise. Sennacherib calls it the palace without rival, Ekal Shah Shanina La Ishu. The terrace alone requires millions of mud brick, raised and leveled to create a platform 15 meters above the surrounding plain. More than 70 rooms take shape around courtyards designed to funnel light and air. The walls of these rooms are lined, floor to ceiling, with carved alabaster panels, reliefs depicting the king's campaigns, his construction projects, the transport of the very colossi that guard the doors. The total length of carved relief in this single building will exceed 3 kilometers. The labor force is the empire itself. Deportees from Chaldea, from the Levant, from conquered cities whose names fill the annals, these are the hands that mold the bricks, haul the stone, dig the channels. Administrative tablets assign them rations, barley measured in precise daily quantities, beer brewed in palace workshops, oil for lamps and skin. They speak Aramaic, Babylonian, a dozen other tongues. They do not choose to be here, but their skills, masonry, carpentry, metalwork, canal engineering, are exactly what the king requires, and the deportation system delivers them by the thousands. By 690 before the Common Era, the transformation is visible from any hill within a day's march. Where a provincial cult town stood a generation ago, a metropolis now sprawls across the plain, walled, gated, watered, and crowned by a palace whose carved corridors no visitor can walk without understanding the message. This city is the center of the world, and the king who built it commands everything the eye can see. Yet the palace is not finished, the gardens are not yet planted, and the water that feeds 100,000 people still flows from a river that runs dry in drought years. Sennacherib is already looking toward the mountains, calculating distances, imagining stone channels crossing valleys where no water has ever flowed. The mountains north of Nineveh hold snow into late spring. Meltwater gathers in streams that cut through limestone valleys, pooling in seasonal channels that villagers have tapped for millennia with modest ditches and earthen dams. Sennacherib looks at these streams and sees something no Mesopotamian king has attempted before: a system of engineered canals, not to irrigate a few fields, but to carry an entire river's worth of water across 50 kilometers of broken terrain, and deliver it, reliably and permanently, into the heart of a city of 100,000. The project begins at the headwaters near the hills around Kinis, where inscriptions carved into living rock announce the king's intentions. Channels are cut through bedrock, their gradients calculated so precisely that water flows at a controlled pace, neither pooling nor rushing. Where valleys interrupt the route, massive embankments are raised from packed earth and rubble. Where the terrain drops, spillways and sluice gates regulate the flow. The system is not one canal, but several, built in phases, each extending the reach further towards the city. Sennacherib's own inscriptions enumerate 18 separate watercourses integrated into the network over the course of roughly 15 years. The culmination stands at Jerwan, where the canal must cross a broad valley. Here, engineers construct a bridge of fitted limestone blocks approximately 280 meters long and 22 meters wide, carried on corbelled arches, the earliest large-scale aqueduct bridge documented anywhere in the ancient world. Water flows across its top in a sealed channel lined with waterproof cement. The stones are inscribed. Sennacherib claims the work as his own, naming the distant springs, the conquered landscapes, the will that drew water from rock. When Thorkild Jacobson and Seton Lloyd surveyed the structure in 1935, they found its engineering remarkably sound, its gradient precise to within centimeters per kilometer. Inside Nineveh, the arriving water feeds a distribution network of secondary canals, reservoirs, and sluice-controlled channels. The Kharza River, already flowing through the city, is supplemented and regulated. Water reaches not only the palace complex, but public basins, orchards along the walls, and the vast royal garden that Sennacherib constructs on the city's northern edge. That garden is no mere pleasure ground. His inscriptions list plants gathered from campaigns across the empire and beyond: cotton from the lowlands, vines from the western hills, aromatic trees from mountain forests, swamp reeds transplanted to artificial marshes. Channels raised on stone terraces carry water to elevated plantings, creating the effect of greenery suspended above the plain. The Assyriologist Stephanie Daly, has argued that this engineered garden, not the later Babylonian tradition, may be the historical kernel behind the legendary Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The evidence is circumstantial but compelling. Sennacherib describes irrigated terraces, mechanical water-lifting devices resembling Archimedean screws centuries before Archimedes, and plantings from every corner of the known world. At the garden's edge, the canal water drives mills and fills reservoirs that buffer the city against drought. Administrative tablets record the allocation of water to different quarters, the maintenance crews assigned to canal banks, the penalties for unauthorized diversion. The system transforms Nineveh from a city dependent on a single unreliable river into one fed by an artificial watershed engineered to deliver water in every season. Yet the infrastructure carries its own vulnerability. The canals require constant maintenance, silt must be dredged, embankments repaired after every spring flood, limestone joints resealed. The labor force that keeps the system running is drawn from the same deportee populations that build the walls and carve the reliefs. As long as the empire's machinery delivers workers and resources, the water flows. The aqueduct at Jerwan stands as a monument to what imperial will can achieve when resources are limitless. But limestone cracks, silt accumulates, and the empire that funds the repair crews is already stretching its armies across frontiers from Egypt to Elam, each campaign drawing labor and silver further from the channels that keep 100,000 people alive. The stone comes from Balatai, a quarry in the hills roughly 50 kilometers northeast of the city. Blocks of gypsum alabaster, pale and fine-grained, are cut from the living rock, loaded onto sledges, and dragged by teams of laborers down to the Tigris plain. Sennacherib's own inscriptions describe the process with a builder's pride, the sheer tonnage, the thousands of workers, the ropes and rollers. Each slab arrives at Kuyunjik weighing several tons, destined for a room it will never leave. By 690 before the Common Era, the Southwest Palace is taking its final shape. The structure sprawls across the summit of the citadel mound, its foundations cut deep into earlier occupation layers. More than 70 rooms open off corridors and courtyards, their walls lined with carved alabaster panels rising to the height of a tall man. The total length of carved relief in this single building stretches beyond 3 kilometers. No palace in Mesopotamia, no building anywhere on Earth at this date, carries anything comparable. The throne room is the heart. A visitor entering through its massive doorway passes between colossal winged bull figures, each carved from a single block, 5-legged so they appear to stride forward from any angle. Inside, the walls narrate in stone. Campaign after campaign unfolds in horizontal registers. Siege ramps pushed against city walls, rivers forded by swimming soldiers buoyed on inflated skins, tribute processions bearing cedar logs and metal ingots, captive populations marching in long files toward resettlement. The carving is precise enough to distinguish ethnic dress, weapon types, and architectural details of conquered cities. One suite of rooms carries the siege of Lachish in Judah, depicted with extraordinary specificity. The double walls of the city, the Assyrian ramp built against its southwest corner, siege engines advancing uphill. Archaeology at Lachish itself has confirmed the ramp's existence and position exactly as the reliefs show it. Here, art and evidence converge. The palace walls function simultaneously as royal propaganda, military record, and something approaching documentary illustration. Yet the reliefs are not merely chronicles of war. Panels in other rooms depict the quarrying and transport of the bull colossi themselves, workers hauling the massive sculptures on wooden sledges, overseers directing from elevated positions, the landscape rendered with surprising naturalism. Sennacherib wanted visitors to understand not only the reach of his armies, but the scale of labor his will could command. Torchlight would have animated these corridors. The gypsum surfaces, slightly translucent, catch and hold warm light. Shadows shift across the carved figures as a flame passes. Foreign ambassadors walking these halls toward the throne room moved through a calculated sequence of overwhelming imagery. Conquest, power, engineering, divine favor, before ever reaching the king. The palace Sennacherib calls the palace without rival in his own inscriptions is, by any measure, the largest and most elaborately decorated structure in the ancient Near East. Its administrative records, found among the ruins, document the daily functioning of an imperial household. Wine deliveries, oil rations, the movements of officials and craftsmen. But in 681 before the Common Era, Sennacherib is struck down within a palace. The Babylonian Chronicle records his death at the hands of his own sons. The biblical Book of Kings preserves a parallel account. The details remain debated, but the fact is stark. The builder of the greatest palace the world had seen perishes inside its walls. His son Esarhaddon seizes the throne after a brief struggle and buries his father with royal honors. The palace survives its builder. Its corridors stand, its reliefs intact, its bull colossi gazing outward from their gateways. Esarhaddon builds his own residence across the city at Nebi Yunus, leaving his father's monument untouched, a finished statement in stone that no successor dares alter. Ashurbanipal, coming after, will raise his own north palace nearby on Kuyunjik, but the southwest palace remains the larger, the more lavish, the one that earns its name. Beneath the carved surfaces, the gypsum is already beginning its slow deterioration. Moisture seeps through mud brick walls. Hairline cracks thread across relief panels. The stone that records an empire's power is softer than it appears, calcium sulfate vulnerable to water and time. For now, the maintenance crews keep the drainage channels clear and the roofs sealed. The palace stands as the empire's mirror, magnificent, intricate, and dependent on constant upkeep from a system that cannot afford to pause. The palace corridors gleam with carved stone, but the city beyond them runs on barley, beer, and the labor of people who did not choose to be here. Administrative tablets from the reigns of Sennacherib and Esarhaddon record them in terse columns: names, origins, ration quantities, work assignments. Babylonians settled in quarters along the Kosra. Aramean families from the Middle Euphrates grouped by tribal affiliation. Chaldeans from the southern marshes, Arabs from the desert fringe, Egyptians taken after Sennacherib's western campaigns, Elamites from the Iranian plateau. The tablets do not use the word slave for most of them. The Akkadian term is nasihu, the uprooted, the transplanted. They are imperial property, but they eat, they work, they raise children, and they fill the streets of a city that could not function without them. The numbers are substantial. Sennacherib's own inscriptions claim the deportation of over 200,000 people from Babylonia alone after his campaign of 689 before the Common Era. Not all came to Nineveh. Many were settled across the Assyrian heartland, in agricultural colonies along canals, but tens of thousands swelled the capital's population. The city within its 12-kilometer walls holds perhaps 100,000 to 150,000 people at its peak, and a significant fraction speak languages other than Akkadian as their mother tongue. Aramaic is everywhere. It has become the empire's practical lingua franca, scratched in ink on potsherds and leather alongside the cuneiform pressed into clay. Scribes increasingly work in pairs, one writing Akkadian in cuneiform, the other noting the same content in Aramaic script. The administrative machinery is bilingual by necessity. The breweries operate at industrial scale. Ration tablets specify daily beer allotments for laborers. 2 liters per adult worker is a common measure, brewed from barley and date syrup in large ceramic vats housed in dedicated production quarters. Barley arrives from granaries that store hundreds of tons, their contents tracked on sealed tablets recording deposits and withdrawals by season. Sesame oil is distributed alongside grain, a caloric supplement and cooking staple measured in precise volumes. Textile workshops employ women and children from deportee families. Wool arrives from flocks maintained on crown lands outside the walls. The tablets record spinners and weavers by name, their output counted in garments, their rations adjusted by age and productivity. Some workshops produce military textiles, felt for armor padding, heavy cloaks for campaign seasons. Others weave finer cloth for palace use and trade. The Mashki Gate and the Haltzi Gate see daily traffic that feeds this system. Copper and tin for the bronze working shops arrive from Anatolia and points east. Timber from Lebanon, already squared, moves on ox-drawn sledges toward construction sites that never fully cease. The market areas near the gates trade in barley, dates, wool, and sesame at prices that fluctuate with harvest and campaign season. A shekel of silver buys roughly 180 liters of barley in a good year, a ratio recorded across multiple tablets that gives the cost of survival a concrete weight. The Kosa River, channeled through the city in its engineered course, turns grinding stones in mills that process grain into flour. Water from Sennacherib's canal system fills reservoirs and feeds smaller channels running to gardens and workshops. The infrastructure demands constant maintenance, silt clearance, embankment repair, sluice adjustment, performed by labor gangs drawn from the same deportee population. Temple precincts add another layer. The Ishtar temple at Kuyunjik maintains its own staff, its own flocks, its own textile production. Offerings flow in daily: animals, grain, beer, aromatics. The temple economy operates semi-independently, its records kept on separate tablet series, its personnel including priests, singers, diviners, and maintenance workers whose families have served for generations alongside newcomers assigned by royal decree. At dusk, smoke from cooking fires rises across the lower city, mud brick houses packed along narrow streets, flat roofs used for sleeping in the summer heat, the smell of baking bread and roasting sesame mixing with the sharper scent of tanning leather from workshops near the river. A dozen languages murmur through the lanes. The city that Sennacherib designed as a monument to Assyrian power is sustained, at every level, by the hands and skills of conquered peoples whose loyalty extends no further than the next ration distribution. Esarhaddon, rebuilding after his own contested succession, continues the system. Fresh deportees arrive from Egypt after his campaigns of the 670s. The city absorbs them as it absorbs everything, efficiently, hungrily, and with no mechanism for what happens when the flow stops. Ashurbanipal takes the throne in 668 before the Common Era, and he is unlike any king Assyria has produced. He can fight, his reliefs will prove that, but he can also read. In his own colophons, pressed into wet clay in his own hand, or dictated to scribes who recorded his words verbatim, he declares it plainly. I read the cunning tablets of Sumer and the obscure Akkadian, which is hard to master. I had my joy in the reading of inscriptions on stone from before the flood. No Assyrian king before him makes such a claim. Literacy for Ashurbanipal is not a scribe's trade. It is a royal weapon. The North Palace rises on Kuyunjik during the early years of his reign, its rooms smaller and more refined than Sennacherib's sprawling complex to the south. Within its walls, in chambers that later excavators will find packed with collapsed shelving and thousands of clay fragments, Ashurbanipal assembles something without precedent in the ancient world. He dispatches agents to temples across Babylonia, Borsippa, Sippar, Nippur, Babylon itself, carrying royal orders that survive on tablet. The instructions are specific. Copy every text in the temple library. Omens, rituals, incantations, medical prescriptions, astronomical observations, mathematical tables, lexical lists, myths, epics, hymns, royal correspondence. If the original cannot be copied, bring it. The king's scribes will make their own additions. The tablets arrive in Nineveh by the cartload. Scribes working in the North Palace copy, collate, and organize them with a system that modern librarians recognize as genuinely functional. Tablets are grouped by subject and stored in designated rooms. Many carry colophons identifying the source text, the scribe who copied it, and the king who ordered the work. Some bear catalogue entries, ancient shelf lists, that tell which tablets belong to which series and in what order they should be read. The total collection reaches over 30,000 tablets and fragments, a number established by the recovery work of Hormuzd Rassam in the 1850s and subsequent British Museum cataloguing that continues to this day. The scope is staggering. The 12 tablets of the Epic of Gilgamesh sit here in their most complete surviving recension. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, is copied in full. Medical texts describe symptoms and treatments for ailments of the eyes, the stomach, the lungs, organized by body part from head to foot. Omen compendia run to dozens of tablets each, cataloguing the meaning of every observable phenomenon, the movements of planets, the shape of a sheep's liver, the behavior of birds, the patterns of smoke rising from incense. Astronomical diaries record eclipses with dates precise enough for modern astronomers to verify. Diplomatic letters from vassal kings across the empire fill entire storage jars. This is not scholarship for its own sake. Knowledge, in the Assyrian worldview, is power over the future. The king who possesses every omen text controls the interpretation of divine will. The king who holds every ritual text can perform, or command the performance of, every ceremony correctly. The library is an instrument of imperial authority as much as any army, a claim to mastery over the accumulated wisdom of Mesopotamian civilization stretching back 2,000 years. In the quiet rooms of the North Palace, lamplight falls across shelves of neatly stacked tablets, each one dense with the tiny wedge marks of cuneiform pressed into clay that has been fired for permanence. The smell is dry clay, sesame oil from the lamps, and the faint mineral scent of the reed styluses. Scribes sit cross-legged, rolling fresh tablets between their palms, copying line by line from originals that are already ancient. Outside, the city hums with its 100,000 voices. Inside, the king's collection grows, text by text, shelf by shelf, assembling a portrait of everything Mesopotamia knows and believes and fears. Ashurbanipal does not know that this library will outlast his empire by millennia, that these tablets will sleep under collapsed roofing and wind-blown earth for over 24 centuries before foreign hands pull them into daylight. He builds it for mastery, for control, for the certainty that no knowledge exists beyond his reach. But even as the scribes copy and catalogue, the empire that funds their work is approaching the limits of what conquest alone can sustain, and the brother the king placed on Babylon's throne is beginning to listen to voices that whisper of independence. The arena is not wilderness. It is a walled enclosure within the royal grounds of the North Palace, a controlled space where caged lions are released through small wooden doors, lifted by attendants standing safely atop the walls. The crowd watches from elevated positions. The king rides forward in his chariot, bow drawn, horses held steady by a driver. Everything is choreographed. Everything is ritual. And the sculptors who will carve this scene into gypsum alabaster panels are watching too, recording every detail with an accuracy that will stun the world 25 centuries later. By roughly 645 before the Common Era, Ashurbanipal commissions a series of reliefs for the North Palace at Kuyunjik that depict the royal lion hunt in extraordinary detail. These are not the stiff, formulaic carvings of earlier reigns. The sculptors working under Ashurbanipal achieve something unprecedented in Mesopotamian art. Naturalism so precise that modern zoologists can identify the species, the musculature rendered with anatomical fidelity, the movement of animals captured mid-stride, mid-leap, mid-collapse. The panels stretch across multiple rooms, carved in low relief on slabs roughly 2 meters tall, lit in their original setting by the dim glow filtering through high doorways. The hunt itself is an act of cosmic maintenance. In Assyrian royal ideology, the king stands as the appointed guardian of civilized order against the forces of chaos. The lion, most powerful predator of the Mesopotamian landscape, embodies that chaos. By confronting and defeating it in a public ritual, the king demonstrates his fitness to rule, his divine mandate renewed with each contest. Administrative records suggest that lions were captured alive in the provinces and transported to Nineveh in wooden cages for precisely this purpose. The arena hunt is theatre, but it is sacred theatre, and the distinction matters. What the sculptors achieve on these panels transcends propaganda. A lioness drags herself forward, hind legs paralyzed, mouth open in what can only be described as anguish rendered in stone. A male lion leaps towards the royal chariot, every muscle tensed, caught in the instant before contact. Attendants carry smaller animals on leashes. The king pours a libation over the fallen lions before a ritual table, acknowledging the sacred dimension of the act. These scenes contain no text. The images carry the entire weight of meaning. The panels are carved from the same pale gypsum quarried at Balatai, the stone that lines every major palace in the city. But the skill here surpasses anything in the southwest palace of Sennacherib. Art historians have identified multiple hands at work, a master sculptor responsible for the animal figures whose technical ability has no equal in the ancient Near East, and workshop assistants handling background elements and repetitive patterns. The reliefs were originally painted, traces of red and black pigment surviving in protected crevices when Hormuzd Rassam excavated the North Palace in 1853. Rassam's workers found the panels fallen face down, preserved beneath the collapsed roof debris that had buried them since 612 before the Common Era. They were carefully extracted, crated, and shipped down the Tigris on rafts to Basra, then by sea to London. Today they occupy a gallery in the British Museum, displayed at eye level under controlled lighting, closer to a viewer's face than they ever were in the dim corridors of the North Palace, where they lined walls above head height, glimpsed by torchlight. The Hunt reliefs reveal a court at the summit of its confidence. The artistry is lavish, the resources abundant, the ideology unquestioned. Ashurbanipal presents himself as scholar, warrior, and ritual protector in a single integrated identity. The library tablets and the lion hunt panels are two faces of the same claim: total mastery over knowledge and nature alike. Yet the lions in the arena are brought from provinces that are growing harder to control. The cages arrive from territories where governors send fewer reports each year, where Aramean and Chaldean populations stir, where the Medes in the eastern mountains are consolidating under a single leader. The empire still funds masterpieces in stone, still stages rituals of cosmic order within palace walls. But beyond those walls, the roads that carry tribute and captive lions toward Nineveh are growing longer, and the forces required to keep them open are stretching thinner with each passing season. The arrangement is older than the war itself. When Esarhaddon divided the empire between his sons, he placed Ashurbanipal on the throne of Assyria and set Shamash-shum-ukin as king of Babylon, a subordinate position wrapped in the dignity of an ancient title. For nearly 16 years the arrangement holds. Tribute flows north along the Tigris corridor. Babylonian temples receive Assyrian patronage. The two brothers correspond through scribes and the fiction of equality papers over the reality of hierarchy. But Babylon remembers what it was before Assyria rose, and Shamash-shum-ukin sits on a throne that carries 3,000 years of independent tradition. The fracture, when it comes, runs along a fault line that was always there. In 652 before the Common Era, Shamash-shum-ukin declares open revolt. He has spent years building a coalition that stretches from the marshes of the Sealand to the highlands of Elam, drawing in Aramean tribes, Chaldean chieftains, and Arab kingdoms, precisely the peoples whose deportees fill Nineveh's workshops and breweries. The timing is calculated. Assyrian armies are committed on multiple frontiers, and the empire's resources are stretched across campaigns from Egypt to the Zagros. Administrative tablets from Nineveh show the disruption immediately. Tribute shipments from southern provinces stop. Grain deliveries recorded in precise monthly quantities simply cease to appear in the ledgers. Ashurbanipal responds with the full weight of the imperial machine. But the war is not a single campaign. It is a 4-year siege of attrition. Assyrian forces encircle Babylon and systematically cut its supply lines. The great city that once fed itself from the richest agricultural plain in the world is slowly strangled. Ashurbanipal's own inscriptions, composed after victory, describe famine inside Babylon's walls in terms that later scholars have debated for their rhetorical exaggeration. But the core fact is confirmed by multiple sources. The city was starved into submission. In 648, Shamash-shum-ukin perishes as his palace burns around him, Whether by his own hand or in the final assault, the sources do not agree. The cost to the victor is enormous. 4 years of civil war have drained the treasury that funded Nineveh's monumental construction. At Kuyunjik, the pace of building slows visibly in the archaeological record. Relief programs that once covered entire palace wings now decorate smaller rooms. The Jerwan aqueduct still carries mountain water into the city. The Ishtar temple still receives offerings, but the surplus that once seemed inexhaustible has contracted. Garrison forces pulled from frontier provinces to fight in Babylonia leave gaps that local powers quietly fill. The Medes under Cyaxares consolidate in the east without serious Assyrian interference. Egypt, reconquered at great expense only a decade earlier, slips permanently from Assyrian control under Psamtik I. The deportation system itself begins to work against the empire. Communities resettled in Assyria from the very regions now in revolt carry news, sympathies, and connections that no administrative apparatus can fully monitor. The multilingual streets of Nineveh, once a testament to imperial reach, now harbor populations whose homelands have just demonstrated that Assyrian power can be challenged and survived. Ashurbanipal's scribes in the North Palace continue copying tablets, cataloging omens, preserving the knowledge of a civilization that still believes itself eternal. The library grows even as the empire shrinks, but the omen collections themselves carry an irony their compilers cannot see. Texts devoted to reading the future, assembled in a city whose future has just been shortened by the very war that proved the empire's strength. The roads south of Nineveh are open again, but they are quieter now. Fewer caravans carry tribute through the Mashki Gate. The granaries still hold reserves, but the margins are thinner. Somewhere in the eastern mountains, a confederation is learning to act as one. Ashurbanipal dies around 631 before the Common Era, and the exact circumstances remain unclear. No royal inscription announces the transition. No monument marks the passing. The most prolific documenter of his own reign simply vanishes from the record, and what follows is a silence more ominous than any siege. His son Ashur-etil-ilani takes the throne, but the succession is contested. A general named Sin-shumu-lishir seizes power briefly. His name appears on a handful of administrative texts and then disappears. Ashur-etil-ilani regains control, or perhaps never fully lost it. The chronology of these years is so uncertain that modern scholars reconstruct it from fragments. A few dated tablets, a broken eponym list, the absence of records where records should exist. The palace scribes at Kuyunjik, who once produced thousands of tablets a year, fall nearly silent. The library shelves hold the knowledge of civilizations, but no one is adding to them now. The walls still stand, 12 kilometers of mud brick and limestone facing, 15 gates with their carved colossi, the double fortification line that Sennacherib raised, all of it intact. But walls without an empire behind them are geometry, not power. Provincial governors who once sent tribute and correspondence to Nineveh stop writing. The archive rooms that should hold letters from Babylonia, from the Levant, from the western provinces, receive fewer tablets each year. The roads that carried copper and tin and lapis lazuli through the Mashki Gate grow quieter. Caravans still arrive, but the network is fraying at its edges. In Babylonia, a Chaldean named Nabopolassar has been building power through the 620s. By 626, he controls Babylon itself and declares independence. The Assyrian garrison cannot dislodge him. For the first time in over a century, Babylon is no longer an Assyrian possession, but a rival state with its own king, its own army, and its own ambitions. The tribute that once flowed north, grain, silver, textiles, labor, now stays in the south or funds campaigns against Assyrian positions along the Euphrates. Sin-shar-ishkun eventually emerges as king in Nineveh, probably after Ashur-etil-ilani's death around 627, though even this date is debated. He is not weak. Babylonian chronicle entries record Assyrian counterattacks, garrison deployments, attempts to hold the middle Euphrates. But the pattern has reversed. Where Tiglath-Pileser and Sennacherib projected force outward across dozens of provinces, Sin-shar-ishkun fights to hold what remains. Each campaign costs men and grain that the shrinking empire can barely replace. East of the Tigris, the Medes are consolidating. Cyaxares unifies the Median tribes into something the Assyrians have never faced from that direction. A centralized military state with disciplined cavalry. The mountain frontier that once supplied Nineveh's water now harbors a power capable of striking the Assyrian heartland itself. The aqueduct from Jerwan still carries water across its limestone arches, but the hills beyond it are no longer safe. Inside the city, the deportee quarters that once teemed with resettled populations from 20 conquered lands still function. Breweries still measure out beer rations. The Ishtar temple still receives offerings. But the engine that filled these quarters, the cycle of conquest, deportation, and forced resettlement, has stopped. No new deportees arrive because no new conquests occur. The existing population ages in place, and the labor force that built and maintained the greatest city on earth is not being replenished. The Kosa River still flows through its engineered channel. The reservoirs still hold water. The granaries along the arsenal walls still store barley. But the margins that once cushioned the city against crisis have been consumed by a decade of civil war and contraction. Nineveh remains the largest city between Egypt and the Iranian plateau, its palaces still filled with carved stone, its library still holding 30,000 tablets of accumulated wisdom. Yet the administrative machinery that connected this capital to an empire stretching from the Nile to the Persian Gulf is dissolving. Province by province, road by road. Somewhere south of the city, Nabopolassar's forces probe northward along the Tigris. Somewhere in the eastern mountains, Cyaxares drills his cavalry into formations that will soon move west. The probing comes first along the river. In 616 before the Common Era, Nabopolassar's Babylonian forces push north up the Tigris Valley, testing Assyrian defenses at towns that a generation earlier would have been garrisoned in depth. The Babylonian Chronicle, the slim clay tablet now catalogued as British Museum 21901, records these campaigns in terse administrative prose: cities taken, cities lost, retreats and advances measured in days of march. Sin-shar-ishkun, the last effective king on the Assyrian throne, fights back. His armies are still formidable. In 616, Assyrian forces push the Babylonians south again, and for a moment the old machine seems to hold. But the pattern has shifted. Nabopolassar does not need to win every engagement. He needs only to keep pressure on the southern flank, while the real danger gathers in the east. Cyaxares has unified the Median tribes into something Assyria has never faced from that direction, a coordinated military kingdom with disciplined cavalry and a single strategic purpose. In 614 before the Common Era, the Medes bypass Nineveh entirely and strike south at Ashur, the ancient religious capital, the city where Assyrian kingship was born. The Babylonian Chronicle records that Nabopolassar marched north to assist, but arrived after the city had already fallen. The Medes had taken Ashur alone. The destruction is thorough enough that the site never recovers as a functioning city. The Sacred Heart of Assyria, the temple of the god whose name the empire carries, lies in ruins. What happens next reshapes the war. Nabopolassar and Cyaxares meet, probably at the smoldering remains of Ashur itself, and formalize an alliance. Later tradition, preserved in Herodotus, claims the pact was sealed by a dynastic marriage. Whether or not the detail is historical, the strategic reality is documented. From 614 onward, Babylon and Media coordinate their campaigns against the Assyrian heartland as a unified coalition. Some sources suggest Scythian contingents join as well, though their role remains debated among scholars. From the walls of Nineveh, the arithmetic is visible. The empire that once stretched from the Nile Delta to the mountains of western Iran has contracted to a corridor along the upper Tigris, a strip of territory perhaps 200 kilometers long, centered on the capital itself. The tribute that once flowed inward from dozens of provinces has stopped. The deportee labor force that built the walls and filled the granaries receives no new replenishment. The city's population, still perhaps 70 to 100,000, must now be fed from a hinterland that shrinks with each campaigning season. Sinsharishkun prepares. The 12 kilometers of double walls remain intact, their mud-brick mass rising 15 meters above the plain, fronted by a moat that can be flooded from the Kosa. The 15 gates are reinforced. The arsenal palace at Nebi Yunus holds chariots and weapons stockpiled across decades. Cisterns are filled. Granaries along the interior walls are packed with barley, enough, the administrators calculate, for months. Diplomatic appeals go outward. To Egypt, where Pharaoh Psamtik I has his own reasons to fear a Babylonian-Median axis, and possibly to remnant Assyrian garrisons still holding positions in the west. An Egyptian force does march north, but it will arrive too late to matter. Through 613, the coalition tightens its grip. Babylonian and Median forces reduce remaining Assyrian strongholds along the Tigris and the Greater Zab. The roads that once carried tin from the east and timber from Lebanon now carry nothing. The aqueduct from the mountains still delivers water. Sennacherib's engineering holds, but the canal-irrigated fields beyond the walls fall within raiding distance. Farmers who once fed the city retreat inside the gates or scatter. By the spring of 612 before the Common Era, the coalition army assembles on the plain east of the Tigris. The Babylonian Chronicle will record what follows in fewer than a dozen lines. The greatest city on earth, home to the largest library in existence, seat of the dynasty that had reshaped the ancient world, watches from its walls as the formations gather on the floodplain below. Median cavalry, Babylonian infantry, allied contingents stretching across the horizon. The Kosa flows through the city as it always has, but the river that Sennacherib tamed carries the spring snowmelt down from the mountains, and the waters are rising. The siege begins in the late spring, when the coalition closes the approaches. The Babylonian Chronicle, preserved on a small clay tablet now catalogued in the British Museum, records the event in lines so compressed that centuries of scholarship have labored to extract their full meaning. What is clear is this: from approximately the month of Simanu, roughly June through the month of Abu, roughly August, the combined forces of Medes, Babylonians, and their allies press against Nineveh's 12 kilometers of double walls. Those walls are formidable. Sennacherib built them a century earlier with an outer circuit of limestone-faced mud brick rising perhaps 15 meters, fronted by a broad moat fed by the colossal. 15 gates, each flanked by towers and colossal stone guardians, control every approach. Inside, granaries hold reserves and cisterns store water. Sin-Shar-Ishkun commands a garrison drawn from the remnants of the Assyrian army, reduced but still trained in the most advanced siege defense techniques the ancient world knows. The city that perfected the art of besieging others now endures the same science turned against it. For weeks, the walls hold. The coalition cannot simply storm a fortification of this scale. Median cavalry controls the surrounding plain, cutting supply lines. Babylonian engineers probe for weaknesses. The city tightens, markets fall quiet. The ration system that once fed deportee laborers by the tens of thousands now measures what remains. Then the river intervenes. The Babylonian Chronicle notes that the river played a role in the city's fall, and the Book of Nahum, a Judean prophetic text composed close to these events, literary rather than military in nature, but reflecting real knowledge of Nineveh's geography, speaks of gates opened by floodwaters. The Kosa, channeled through the city by Sennacherib's own engineering, carries the late spring snowmelt from the Zagros foothills. In a year of heavy runoff, the same watercourse that sustained the city becomes its undoing. Whether the coalition deliberately diverted floodwaters against the walls or simply exploited a natural spate remains debated. What archaeology confirms is that sections of the wall show evidence of water damage and collapse, mud brick dissolving under sustained saturation, foundations undermined where the current pressed hardest. The breach opens. Coalition forces pour through gaps where masonry has slumped into mud. The fighting moves into the streets. Sin-Shar-Ishkun perishes. Later tradition holds he died in his burning palace, though the Babylonian Chronicle does not specify the manner, only the outcome. The city falls in the month of Abu, approximately August of 612 before the Common Era. What follows is systematic. The Chronicle states it plainly. The victors carry off the vast booty of the city and the temple and turn the city into a ruin heap. The temples of Ishtar, maintained for 3,000 years, are stripped. The palaces that held Ashurbanipal's library collapse in fire. The tablets, paradoxically, are hardened by the flames that destroy the wooden shelving, preserving them for excavators 25 centuries later. The Nergal Gate, the Mashki Gate, the Haltzi Gate stand open and unguarded. The aqueduct from Jerwan continues to carry water toward a city that no longer needs it. The destruction is not random. It is the methodical dismantling of an imperial center by enemies who understand exactly what Nineveh represents. The reliefs that lined 3 kilometers of palace corridors, the carved records of Assyrian conquest, lie beneath fallen roofing. The arsenal palace on Nebi Yunus, storing the chariots and siege equipment that projected Assyrian power across the known world, is gutted. Within a generation, the population scatters. Deportee communities, held in place by imperial administration, disperse to their ancestral regions or drift into the countryside. The skilled craftsmen, the scribes, the brewers measuring daily rations, all gone. The Kosa flows through empty streets, silting the canals that once distributed its water to gardens and reservoirs. Mud brick, without maintenance, begins its slow return to earth. The Assyrian rump state retreats west to Haran, clinging to a diminished throne for 2 more years before that city too falls in 610. But Nineveh's story as a living city ends here, in the summer heat of 612, with smoke rising over the mounds of Kuyunjik and the silence of empty gateways settling over what had been, only months before, the largest city on earth. Within a generation, the city that had commanded the world from the Tigris to the Nile becomes unrecognizable. Rain dissolves the upper courses of the mud brick walls. Wind carries dust into the palace corridors, where carved alabaster panels still line the rooms, buried now under collapsing roof beams and clay. The 12-kilometer circuit of fortifications, once the most formidable defensive perimeter on Earth, sags and slumps into long earthen ridges. The canals that Sennacherib engineered to carry mountain water through the city silt up within years, their sluice gates jammed, their channels becoming shallow depressions in the plain. The Kosa still flows, but it flows through ruin. The Babylonians who destroyed Nineveh do not rebuild it. Nabopolassar and his son Nebuchadnezzar pour their imperial ambitions into Babylon itself, raising the Ishtar Gate and the Great Ziggurat on the Euphrates. Nineveh holds no strategic value for them. The Medes withdraw eastward. The site becomes what it had been 6,000 years before, a place where 2 rivers meet, where soil is fertile, where shepherds graze flocks on mounds whose contents they do not suspect. The speed of forgetting is remarkable. When Xenophon leads his 10,000 Greek mercenaries north along the Tigris in 401 before the Common Era, barely 2 centuries after the fall, they pass enormous ruins. Xenophon records a deserted city he calls Mespila, noting walls built on a stone foundation, 6 parasangs in circuit. He attributes them to the Medes. He does not know he is walking past the capital of the Assyrian Empire. The name Nineveh does not appear in his account. The city has already lost its identity to the people who walk its surface. The mounds endure. Kuyunjik, the great tell where the palaces of Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal lie buried, rises roughly 30 meters above the plain. Nebi Yunus, the second major mound to the south, accumulates its own layers of later occupation. At some point, the chronology is uncertain, but likely falls within the early centuries of the Common Era. Local tradition identifies Nebi Yunus with the tomb of the prophet Jonah, the man whom the Hebrew Bible says was sent by God to preach to Nineveh. A shrine grows on the mound. A village clusters around it. The name Nineveh survives here, but only as a biblical echo, a story of divine warning delivered to a wicked city. In the wider world, Nineveh persists as a literary ghost. The Book of Nahum preserves a fierce poetic account of the city's fall. The Book of Jonah uses it as a symbol of urban enormity, a city of 3 days' journey across. The text claims, an exaggeration that nonetheless preserves the memory of extraordinary scale. Greek and Roman writers mention it occasionally. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, describes its vast walls and attributes its founding to a legendary king named Ninus. But no one in the classical world visits the actual site and connects it to the name. The mounds sit in plain sight, unread. Centuries pass. The Tigris floods and retreats. Arab geographers of the medieval period know the mounds across the river from Mosul. Some correctly associate them with ancient Nineveh. The great traveller Ibn Jubayr passes through in 1184 of the Common Era and notes the ruins. But no one digs. The palace reliefs lie under meters of packed earth. Ashurbanipal's library, 30,000 tablets carrying the oldest literature in human history, sits in darkness, the clay dry and intact, waiting. By the 18th century, European travelers begin arriving in Mosul and gazing across the Tigris at the mounds with growing curiosity. Carsten Niebuhr visits in 1766. Claudius James Rich, the British resident in Baghdad, surveys the site in 1820 and produces the first measured plan of the mound of Kuyunjik, collecting inscribed bricks and pottery fragments. He senses something enormous beneath the surface, but lacks the resources to excavate. His published account circulates in London and Paris, planting a seed. The mounds wait. Beneath Kuyunjik, the winged bulls still guard doorways no one has entered in over 2,000 years. The tablets still hold their text. The carved reliefs still show armies marching, gardens flowing, lions turning in the arena. Everything the city made and everything the city knew lies sealed in earth, across the river from a living city that has grown up in its shadow, without fully understanding what it shadows. The first shovels are still years away. In 1842, Paul-Émile Botta, the French consul at Mosul, drives the first systematic trenches into Kuyunjik. He finds fragments, inscribed bricks, scraps of carved gypsum, but the results disappoint, and within months he redirects his crews 14 kilometers northeast to Khorsabad, where sculptured walls emerge almost immediately. Botta has found Sargon II's palace at Dur Sharukin, and the announcement electrifies Paris. But he has left the greater prize untouched. 3 years later, in 1845, a 28-year-old Englishman named Austin Henry Layard arrives at the mounds with almost no funding, a firman of questionable scope, and a conviction that the biblical Nineveh lies beneath Kuyunjik. He begins at Nimrud first, pulling colossal winged bulls from the earth within days, but by 1847 he turns his attention to Kuyunjik itself. The work is brutal. Local laborers, Kurdish and Arab men whose names appear in Layard's notebooks only as headcounts, dig with picks and baskets through meters of compacted debris. Tunnels follow walls in near darkness. And then the carved panels begin to appear, processions of soldiers, siege engines rolling against fortified cities, gardens with water channels, the king on his throne receiving tribute. Room after room of Sennacherib's southwest palace emerges, over 70 chambers, their alabaster walls still bearing reliefs that stretch, in total, more than 3 kilometers. The Lachish siege panels surface intact, showing an event corroborated by both Assyrian and biblical texts. Colossal lamassu figures, human-headed winged bulls weighing up to 30 tons, guard doorways that have stood sealed since the city's destruction 24 centuries earlier. Layered ship sculptures downriver on rafts to Basra and onward to London. The British Museum opens its Assyrian galleries, and Victorian England confronts a civilization older and in some ways grander than anything Greece or Rome produced. Layard's published account, Nineveh and its Remains, becomes a bestseller in 1849. But the library remains hidden. In 1853, Hormuzd Rassam, an Assyrian Christian from Mosul, who had served as Layard's assistant and now leads his own excavations, cuts into the north palace of Ashurbanipal on Kuyunjik summit. There, in collapsed chambers where shelving had once lined the walls, he finds them. Thousands upon thousands of cuneiform tablets and fragments packed in fallen earth. Over 30,000 pieces eventually reach London, the largest single body of cuneiform text ever recovered from one site. Among them are astronomical records, medical prescriptions, omen compendia, diplomatic letters, and literary works copied from originals already ancient when Ashurbanipal's scribes transcribed them. The full significance takes years to surface. In 1872, a self-taught Assyriologist named George Smith, working in the British Museum's study rooms, pieces together a tablet numbered K3375 and realizes he is reading a Mesopotamian flood narrative, a story of a man warned by a god to build a boat, to load it with animals, to survive a deluge that destroys the world. It predates the biblical account by centuries. Smith presents his translation to the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London on December 3, 1872. The audience includes the Prime Minister. The Daily Telegraph funds Smith's journey to Nineveh to search for the missing fragment, and he finds it an act of archaeological luck almost beyond belief. The discovery reshapes the understanding of human literary history. The Epic of Gilgamesh, reassembled from Ashurbanipal's library tablets, becomes recognized as the oldest great work of literature on earth. Nineveh, a name known only from scripture and a few Greek references, is suddenly real, its palaces photographed, its art displayed, its written records legible. Excavations continue intermittently through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. R. Campbell Thompson and Max Mallowan work at Kuyunjik in the 1920s and early 30s, cutting deep soundings that reach prehistoric levels beneath the Ishtar Temple, 6,000 years of occupation stratified in earth. They establish the pottery sequences that anchor northern Mesopotamian chronology to this day. Yet for all the material removed, the excavated area remains a fraction of the walled city. Beneath the surface, corridors still run uncleared, tablets still lie in their collapse, and entire districts of the imperial capital have never been touched by a trowel. After Thompson and Mallowan pack their tools in the early 1930s, the work passes to Iraqi hands. The Iraqi Directorate of Antiquities takes stewardship of the site through the middle decades of the 20th century, conducting targeted excavations at Nebi Yunus, the second great mound, long untouchable because a mosque and a village sit atop it. Beneath that inhabited ground lies what Sennacherib's inscriptions call the Arsenal Palace, a military storehouse and review complex that no foreign expedition had been permitted to dig. Iraqi archaeologists uncover portions of its massive foundations, carved threshold slabs, and administrative spaces that confirm the palace's function as a logistics center for the imperial army. Each season reveals more of the city's infrastructure, walls, drains, domestic quarters, but funding is limited, and the walled enclosure of roughly 750 hectares remains overwhelmingly unexcavated. Estimates suggest that even after a century and a half of digging, perhaps 80% or more of Nineveh has never been touched. Meanwhile, the legendary city and the excavated city diverge. The Bible's Nineveh is a byword for wickedness and divine punishment, the book of Nahum's poetry, the book of Jonah's moral fable. But the cuneiform record tells a different story: administrative efficiency, systematic knowledge collection, engineering ambition, and a multicultural population managed through bureaucracy as much as force. The reassessment of Assyrian violence, once taken at face value from royal propaganda reliefs, gains nuance as scholars compare Assyrian practices with those of contemporary Egyptian, Babylonian, and Elamite states. The empire was brutal, but not uniquely so. The boasts carved on palace walls were designed to terrify, and scholars now read them as performance as much as record. Eponym lists and the Babylonian Chronicle allow precise dating of reigns and campaigns, replacing biblical chronology with an independent Assyrian framework accurate to the year. Then comes destruction of a kind no archaeologist anticipated. In the summer of 2014, armed forces seize Mosul and the ruins across the river. Over the following months, the reconstructed Nergal Gate, its winged bull replicas a landmark for decades, is demolished. Bulldozers scrape sections of the wall circuit. Yet beneath Nebi Yunus, tunnels dug by the occupiers in search of saleable artifacts cut into a previously unknown palace of Esarhaddon. When Iraqi and international teams enter those tunnels after liberation in 2017, they find massive stone inscriptions, carved reliefs, and cuneiform texts that no scholar had ever catalogued. Destruction paradoxically opens a window into rooms that the mosque above had protected from excavation for centuries. Today the mounds rise above the east bank of the Tigris, scarred but enduring. International conservation teams stabilize tunnel walls and document exposed reliefs before weather claims them. Across the river, modern Mosul rebuilds. The tablets, those 30,000 fragments that Rassam pulled from Ashurbanipal's library, still sit in the British Museum, still yielding new readings as imaging technology reveals signs invisible to the naked eye. The Epic of Gilgamesh, first read aloud in London in 1872, remains the oldest great work of literature known to humanity, and it came from this mound. Beneath the surface of Kuyunjik and Nebi Yunus, corridors run uncleared into darkness. Entire palace wings, domestic quarters, temple archives, and workshop districts lie sealed in their own collapse, waiting. The city that ruled the world from the Nile to the Persian Gulf, that vanished so completely a Greek army walked past without recognition, that slept beneath its own dust for 24 centuries before the first trowel broke the surface. That city is still being found. Its story is not finished. It is only partially read, like a tablet still half buried in the earth. Thank you for walking these ancient streets across every chapter of this journey. If this story moved you, consider subscribing so you will not miss the next city whose stones still have something to say.